Oh, we're not live yet, sorry. We're going to reconvene our meeting and continue discussing S100 and welcome Ed Stanek.
Thank you, Chairman Sheldon, Chair Sheldon. By way of introduction, my name is Ed Stanek. I'm a resident of Barry City. I was employed for 30 years as a district coordinator for the Act 250 program, District 5, which consists of the 35 towns in Washington and Lamoille County. I also served for 6 years as a member of the Barry City School Board, including 1 year as chair, and for 3 terms as president of the Vermont State Employees Association. I mention those backgrounds simply because my testimony will be provided from those 3 different perspectives, and I thank you for this opportunity to testify. There's no doubt that Vermonters are experiencing a severe housing crisis. It is likewise certain that this crisis has been growing for years. Solutions to this crisis require clarity regarding both the causes and the potential solutions, such as those contained in S100. The Act 250 permitting process and housing issues are pretty much revealed by statistics. The NRB provided this committee on April 21st, last Friday, with statistics about the processing of Act 250 applications. In the written version of my testimony, I provide you with direct links to those submittals from the NRB. The long story short, those statistics reveal that over the last 5-year period, over 3,000 housing units have been permitted by Act 250, and that 89% of those 3,000 units were processed by Act 250 as so-called minor applications, meaning that there were no hearings, there were no parties involved, it was an expedited review. The average processing time for those applications was 73 days. The NRB also provided statistics about appeals. Legislators are often told that the appeals of Act 250 decisions are causes of delay and cost. But indeed, in the annual report given to the legislature, this one was dated February 15, 2023, and again, I have a link in my testimony. At page 8 in that report are the statistics on the appeals of Act 250 over the last 5 years. Over the last 5 years, in total, of all land uses, there have only been 30 appeals of Act 250 applications, only 30. That's an average of 6 per year, and that's all land uses, not just housing. Thus, it's reasonable to conclude that there really is no demonstrable proof, as opposed to anecdotes and myths, that the Act 250 process is a measurable cause of the housing crisis. Over time, priority housing projects have been exempted from Act 250 review. The NRB also provided this committee last week with statistics on the number and locations of the preferred housing projects that have been permitted. Upon closer review, it's interesting to note, although there are hundreds and hundreds of projects which were permitted and therefore exempt from Act 250, many of those projects have not proceeded to construction. So simply expediting permits does not automatically equate with shovels going in the ground. It would be interesting to look at some of those projects permitted, not yet under construction, as to what causes the delay in construction taking place. Legislators are also told that Act 250 is a duplicative permitting process and that towns with zoning and subdivision bylaws are adequately prepared to assess the impacts of proposed development. Some towns indeed have strong bylaws and well-trained DRB members, but they are a minority. Many DRBs have significant turnover in membership, while others have members who see their role as fostering growth rather than applying the bylaws. And some members, unfortunately, have conflicts of interest. To be clear, this is not meant by me to be a broadside against local control, merely my honest observations for many years of witnessing the administration of municipal bylaws in the 35 towns in District 5. Although the legislature has mandated many studies over the decades of the Act 250 program, to my knowledge, there has never been a comprehensive quality control study of how the enabling provisions of 24 VSA Chapter 117 have actually been implemented by the towns. For the last 50 years, the complementary, not competitive, not duplicative, but the complementary roles of municipal DRBs and Act 250 district commissions have served the public interest well. It has not been uncommon, for example, to have a DRB indicate that certain issues and complicated cases like floodplains, like brownfields, even traffic, that those issues, quote unquote, will be taken care of by Act 250, and the DRB passes the ball on those issues. So it's worked quite well for the last several decades in terms of a hand-in-glove approach to how development gets reviewed. I'd like to move on to some comments specific to sections in S100 itself. Section 16 in the bill is the provision which raises the threshold on jurisdiction from 10 units to 25 units. This provision originates from a fixation that reductions in land use regulation will somehow result in an increase in the construction of new housing, despite the lack of proof that existing regulations have been detrimental. So we're going to raise the threshold with no indication that there's a significant problem caused by the current threshold of 10 units. Section 16A in the bill proposes a new master plan permit process. The town can enter into this before a district commission. From my perspective, it's difficult to fathom why any town would want to pursue such a permit. Even worse, attempting to implement this section seems most likely to result in significant cost to the town and the making real of the concern of the Vermont Supreme Court that the administration of Act 250 can turn into an administrative nightmare. The court said that years ago in Re Agency of Administration, which was a master plan case, ironically involving the Capital District itself in Montpelier. So again, Section 16A sounds good, master plan permit process. I think very few, if any, towns are even going to take advantage of it. Section 17 is the provision which talks about enhanced village designations, which would increase the jurisdictional threshold from 10 units to 50 units. The enhanced designation, the way I read the bill, would be met if three rather anemic requirements are met by the municipality. One, that there are permanent zoning and subdivision bylaws. Two, that there's municipal water or sewer infrastructure. And three, that there's adequate staff on the town level to carry it out. So think about that. Those are the three standards which result in the enhanced designation, raising the threshold from 10 units to 50 units. What happens to the combined and cumulative impacts of the build out over time of those multiple units in a small compressed setting like the village? Act 250 has experience, on the other hand, dealing with those cumulative and combined impacts over the course of time. Section 17C in the bill extends the scope of a report which the NRB is to give to the General Assembly by December 2023. That report was originally to cover quote unquote necessary updates to Act 250. S100 would add to that charge by having the report include jurisdictional standards for housing projects that will lead to affordability, and what would be the effects on the quote unquote natural and community resources protected under the Act 250 criteria. To cut to the chase, I feel strongly that the NRB is incapable of producing a sufficient report because it lacks the expertise and experience to do so. I will discuss this in more depth in a few minutes under my testimony for sections 18 and 19, that being the inability of the NRB to perform its duties. But as an aside, and I testified before this committee during the last two legislative sessions, I believe there is indeed much wisdom in pursuing consideration of new location-based jurisdictional triggers for Act 250. I think that's a really important idea to move Act 250 into the 21st century. I can be as pragmatic as the next person when it comes to legislation. And then frankly, I'd be glad to even think about a horse trade. In other words, perhaps jurisdictions should be ceded to the municipalities and A&R permitting in the valleys, and Act 250 should be retooled to deal with the impacts of growth in the 21st century in the higher elevations. I use 1,500 feet as a line in the sand, protection of the headwaters and stuff like that. But that's not the subject of S100. That's down the road. And as I said, it's an aside about further considerations in a comprehensive way of changing the jurisdictional triggers for Act 250. Back to S100, sections 18 and 19 in the bill talk about enhanced designations for designated areas. Again, I think there's a strong probability that few, if any, towns will make use of the convoluted process as it's spelled out in the bill. But more to the point, this would all play out in front of the Natural Resources Board itself. I and others believe that the NRB is a failed administrative entity. It's been flawed from its creation back in 2005 during the so-called permit reform legislation. The NRB has never performed or been involved in any fact-finding proceedings. Fact-finding is as much an art as it is an acquisition of skill sets. Few, if any, NRB members have had any actual experience on the district commission level. Proactive rulemaking is an integral function of any administrative body because the rules ensure the orderly and efficient operation of the program. The fact is, the NRB itself has not undertaken any rulemaking efforts since 2015. I listened to Mr. Hale's testimony a few minutes ago, and it doesn't have to be that way for a developer such as Mr. Hale building development. If the NRB had a hands-on approach to overseeing the Act 250 program, they could have been extremely proactive over the last several years. They could have revised Act 250 Rule 51, which deals with so-called minor applications. Provisions could have been added to Rule 51 specific to housing to speed things along. For example, Mr. Hale should be invited in for a pre-application meeting with the district commission staff. It's absurd to handle a developer like Mr. Hale with 32-page application form. That makes no sense. Back in the day, there used to be a short form for projects like that. How come that doesn't exist anymore? The NRB really hasn't done its job. In terms of reducing cost for these projects, I think the fee could be reduced. That would require a legislative amendment since fees are locked in by statute. But either a reduction in the fees for housing projects or a temporary waiver of them would certainly reduce the cost upfront for a developer like Mr. Hale. The point here is that if we had a proactive NRB, affordable housing would move more efficiently through the process as it is right now. The NRB, in addition, has been without a rudder. It does not engage in substantive work at its meetings. It would be informative for this committee to conduct a review of the NRB meeting minutes. And one would see that it now meets on a quarterly basis and the average meeting time of its meetings are 10 minutes. So this is the entity to which the charge would be given to carry out all these other processes as spelled out in S100. It simply isn't capable of doing it. There have been proposals in the last couple of sessions to replace the NRB, which are much more viable board. Unfortunately, those provisions haven't gone anywhere. So in summary about Act 250 changes, the net outcome of the approach in S100 to address housing by means of a reduced role for Act 250, from my point of view, will have no tangible effects in resolving the housing crisis. Deregulation will only result in the dismantling of a process that has worked well for many years. I wanted to address three other factors about the housing crisis. This comes from my perspective on the school board in Barre City and also as the president of the SCA. I was on the school board down here in Barre between 1984 and 1990. At that time, Barre City had jurisdiction over K through 12, including what was then called the Vocational Training Center. That was the transition period when high-tech jobs were coming in, right? All the kids were being encouraged to train for computer skills. Some of us asked, well, what's going to happen to the ongoing traditional trades, the carpenters, the plumbers, the electricians? Are we going to ensure an adequate workforce going forward? That was all lost in the shuffle of high-tech jobs. We made additional inquiry of the department, now Agency of Education. We got no assurances from them of policies and programs to train carpenters, electricians, and plumbers going forward. So this crisis has been a tidal wave building over time. Now we have an inadequate workforce to construct affordable housing. In my written testimony, I provided a link to a good article in 7 Days from last fall, which took a look at the workforce in Vermont. And indeed, the fact is, we need 500 to 1,000 new trained people for these construction jobs in order to build housing. They simply aren't on the radar scope. Again, this is no surprise. Back in 2000, the district commission I worked for reviewed the $300 million master plan for Stone Mountain Resort. There were substantial issues across the 10 criteria. The district commission retains its own expert, an economist named Tom Cavett. I'm sure some of you are aware of Tom because he does work for the Joint Fiscal Office. And Tom, on behalf of the district commission, took a look at the master plan provided by the corporation. And the point is this: even in that time period of 2000, it was recognized that all the construction that was going to go on in Stone Mountain Resort could not be sustained by the Vermont workforce. There simply were not construction workers to do all that construction. So the secondary impact for that project was construction workers that were going to come into Vermont to build the project. Where were they going to live? What would be the effect on affordable housing? Were they going to be pushing Vermonters out of apartments and other places to live? So again, that was over 20 years ago. This crisis has been building, and building. And the issue here is we can issue all the permits in the world and grease the chutes as much as we want, but if there is not an adequate workforce, who's going to build all this housing? Who's going to renovate the housing? I walk around here in Barry City and there's empty homes all over the place, but no people with skill sets to renovate that housing. I fear this is only going to get much worse. With the money, the ARPA money coming in and the anticipated construction projects for infrastructure, there's going to be even more pressure put on the workforce to do those projects. At the same time, we're trying to build affordable housing. So I think that's a very substantial missing link in this discussion about the affordable housing crisis in Vermont. Who's going to build all this housing? Another concern is the Airbnb phenomenon. You know, we think Airbnb has been with us forever. Airbnb only began in 2008. And again, to cut to the chase, here in Vermont, the number of short-term rental units has risen from about 6,600 units in 2017, and it's around 9,700 units at present. In other words, the point is this: during that 5-year period, there was a loss of over 3,000 units that would otherwise provide housing for full-time Vermont residents. They were converted into a land use which would otherwise have been met by hotels, motels, beds and breakfast, or inns. So we are now missing 3,000 apartments and homes which would otherwise house Vermonters. Now, Vermont's not the only state that's facing this phenomenon. I would encourage the committee to take a look at studies and reports performed by other states to come up with a remedy for that. And in fact, other states have implemented successful solutions to address the loss of units to the Airbnb phenomenon. This really cries out for immediate legislative action to return these existing units in Vermont to the housing pool, not for tourists, but for full-time residents. Think about that. 3,000 units disappeared from the housing pool in the last 5 years. And the second category of missing housing, the way I'll put it, is the phenomenon caused by second and third homes in Vermont. You may have seen an analysis done by the Pew Family Trust, which considered housing vacancy rates in the states across the country. Vermont is tied for first place with the state of Maine for the highest vacancy rate of existing structures, existing residential structures. A significant factor of this is seasonal homes in Vermont. There indeed was a time in Vermont from the 1950s through the 1970s when there actually was a surplus of housing in Vermont. And that dovetailed well with the policy at the time to increase the tourist economy in Vermont. It worked well at that time. But I think now the time has come to revisit those policies to see if they should still be encouraged. Think about that. 20% of our housing stock is sitting vacant because people only use those structures maybe 2 or 3 weeks out of the year. There's quite an array of tools in the legislative toolbox as to how those units can be pushed back into the housing pool for full-time Vermonters to provide housing. So in conclusion, the housing crisis in Vermont has many causes, and it's been unfolding for decades. Unfortunately, there's no quick fix. But one thing is clear, at least to me: reliance on accelerated deregulation and market forces will not solve the crisis. Further deregulation through increased jurisdictional exemptions will only weaken the effective Act 250 permitting process and lessen the opportunity for legitimate public participation in district commission proceedings. In all honesty, it's a bit of magical thinking to assume that reductions in regulatory reviews will somehow increase the construction of new housing. At the same time, the desperate need to reintegrate available housing units back into the bank of homes and apartments, full-time residents, cries out for regulatory measures. Thank you for your consideration of my comments. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you for your testimony, Representative Smith and then Sibilia.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. I'm reading the exceptional vacancy rate of Vermont housing stock. And it's saying here there's a high percentage tied with Maine. Now, when they're considering this, are they considering, like I own a camp with no facilities, I pay non-resident taxes on it. Is that part of this consideration?
I believe what they did, the short answer is yes. I believe they took a look at all inhabitable residences in the states and then determined, I think the factor they used, how many are vacant 6 months or more of the year. And that was the definition they used to come up with the vacancy rate.
So,
but that report is available online.
Would it be safe to say, you think, that there may be, if there's 1,000 or 1,500 hunting camps in the state, that's part of this misunderstood percentage?
Based on the definition of the Pew Trust, I guess that would be true, yes.
Okay, because it just seems like there's not, I'm sure there's a lot of seasonal homes, but, and probably seasonal homes is no comparison to what my camp in the woods is, but I'm just curious as if those were considered. So.
Representative Sibilia.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Stanek. I have three items I want to ask you about. I heard you talk about the success that we've seen with Act 250 thus far. Can you point to something around that has worked really well with Act 250 that has led to the building of housing?
So how has Act 250 encouraged housing?
Yes.
I think one clear answer is in the statistics themselves that Act 250 has processed 3,000 units as minor applications. So they went through the process in a matter of 30 to 60 days. So I think that's a significant contribution to housing in terms of expediting the ability for shovels to go in the ground.
So going through a permitting process was an incentive. It helped increase housing in the state.
Yeah, another good example too is Act 250 for over 25 years now in reviewing the large master plans for ski areas has been taking steps to attach permit conditions for mitigation payments by the resorts towards the funds for affordable housing. And in fact, that primed the pump. I think one of the first commissions that did that was District 5 in the context of the Still Mountain Resort. So for every unit built at a resort like that, there's been a contribution paid to the Regional Housing Trust to help subsidize construction of affordable housing. So there's an affirmative example of how Act 250 has actually, in a real way, been helping to fund affordable housing.
So not one of my remaining two questions, but would love to follow up with you on how those funds are expended and where throughout the state. You talked about the need for 500 to 1,000 new people to build housing. And of course, we have a pretty significant workforce shortage across all of our sectors. Where do you think those folks will live, that if we could get them here?
Well, that's a great question. I volunteered for quite a number of years here in Barrie at the Good Samaritan Homeless Shelter. And I'm so great to see some of those people now living in our community because that provided the relief they needed. I guess answering your question, I see a lot of folks, a lot of young folks now who would benefit from skill sets that would help them move out of either a homeless situation or an unemployed or an underemployed situation, give them the skill sets so they would move up the ladder. And then in turn, that would be able to help them sustain affordable housing units. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I just wanted to make that link. The training of a workforce would also be able to help people move into housing and help solve the problem.
I'm not sure that, thank you for your answer. I'm not sure that that actually addressed my question. Of course, we've got a huge demographic shift in our country and shift in the global workforce. But if we were to bring in a skilled workforce, and of course we need it for housing and other infrastructure projects, I'm not sure where we would put them. I'm not sure, where the housing is for them through the state, which I guess would lead me to my next question. You may or may not know, I live in a resort town, one of the larger resort towns in the state, Dover, and the buildings in our town, we have 1/5 of our grand list is residential, 4/5 is non-residential. The employment base, the employment opportunities for folks are not centrally located in along the spine of the Green Mountains where a lot of these vacant homes are. So, and I've heard this notion before of somehow we can incentivize, put in place some sort of policy with these vacant vacation homes that could help Vermonters. Talk to me a little bit more. We might be looking at in the valley where I live, 4,000 or 5,000, homes. Well, probably 3,000 or 4,000 units, maybe 5,000 units, but no employment base. So how does that? And my question is because I feel like that's just something that we can point to and say we don't need housing because we got that, and we could just make that housing for Vermonters. So how does that work? Housing on the base of Mount Snow for folks that are trying to work in Springfield at the hospital or in Brattleboro at the retreat or in Bennington at Mac Molding. How does that work?
Well, I think that's why the legislature should have a study commission on this to figure out all those, the answers to all of those questions. I mean, one answer that comes to mind is a solid transportation system would make it feasible for people to be transported from the rural settings to the areas where the jobs are. In all honesty, I don't have the answer to your question. I think the point I just try and make is that there are existing units in Vermont, homes, which are not being used. Meanwhile, we have full-time Vermont residents that are struggling for a place to live. It seems like there's a disconnect there. I don't know the answer, but the reality is that there are these residential units being underutilized.
So, just last question, actually, just back on this topic. So, in Dover, where we have this plethora of housing for our weekend residents, it's 35 minutes to our employment centers. So does that housing in our mountainous region and then 30 or 35 minutes round trip to employment centers, is that kind of the fitting into our ideal of smart growth?
Well, we're living in the age of people working remotely. I would note that. So it would seem to me that, folks could be living in some of these residences, assuming that there's adequate infrastructure available and working remotely.
Yeah, and I think a lot of folks are working remotely for Connecticut and New York, but probably not at Mac Molding or on the floor of the retreat. Thank you.
Other questions for Mr. Stanek? Thank you for your testimony. Next up, we have John Adams.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
I'm John Adams, Director of the Vermont Center for Geographic Information. And is it possible to share my screen here?
Yeah, I think you've been given screen share.
Excellent. So I've prepared a few slides for the committee relating specifically, I guess, to population estimates a question I received around population estimates and designated centers. See, for those who aren't familiar, I don't think I've been in this committee for a while now. So what does the Vermont Center for Geographic Information do? A big part of what we do is build some of the state's foundational data sets. So things like our statewide parcel data, our elevation data, our imagery and administrative boundaries. We lead the use and development and coordination of our geographic information system. So working with our partner agencies at ANR and E911 and Agency of Transportation, make sure we're coordinated and making data available that meets certain standards. And then we work to empower folks with access to data and visualization, enabling them to see it and use it through things like map viewers and participating and helping folks like this committee and working on things like providing data when requested. So we've received a number of requests throughout, I think, S100, the life of S100 and before, related to designated downtowns, one of them being related to the size of those designated areas in relation to the state. So here's a slide showing, the 32 square miles in relation to the 9,600 square miles of the state of Vermont. And just recently we asked the question, does anyone know the percent of the population living in designated centers in Vermont? And we went and looked at some numbers and came up with an estimate around 12.7% living on inside designated areas. That would be all of them. And to 87% on the outside. We did this using a population model, using 2020 census data, E911 residential points, and additional data sources like the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission's housing data, our parcel data, and then others like Green Mountain Power and other local sources where available. And typically we would use just census data, but since we're dealing with such discrete areas, that wasn't possible. So census blocks are the most granular geography for which population counts are available. This gives you a picture of sort of the different geographies that census data is published at. If you look at that block level, when we say, okay, tell me which blocks are, let's say, in a designated area, you would capture areas that are much larger than those. So, this is an instance where we're just trying to capture the small yellow point you can barely see there, and we would be counting far too many people. So we built a high resolution population model. We actually did this during the pandemic to help the Department of Health with drive time analyses and the distribution of testing and vaccine locations. And it's really based a lot on the E911 points, and then refining it, excluding things like seasonal units from the grand list, camps, and then making adjustments to it in some areas to adjust for home ownership. Resort towns, pose some interesting challenges, but we tried to refine it best we could. And then also we're accounting for institutional housing. Since then, there's actually been a number of other housing models, and one of them now publicly available, the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. It's gotten much better very recently, also using census data, but a number of other sources, including some that we publish, like our parcels and building footprints, and then other local sources. And their estimate using their data is very similar to ours at 12.4%. I have made it. We did publish the population data on this map viewer. So if you were to go to s100.mapvt.com, you'll see a number of data layers that we've been adding as some of these requests come up. For the population estimates, you would need to toggle them on. So you would select the layer tab. click on the eye icon, and that would turn on the population estimates, and that would give you a high resolution estimate from the land scan or from the Oak Ridge model, each of those points representing approximately 1.5 acres in size. So that these are the slides that I've prepared for the committee, and I'm happy to answer any questions related to this or any of the other map layers we have available.
Great, thank you. We do have a link to this mapping tool that you've shared with us, but I'm also would love it if you could send us your slides after we wrap up.
Yes, I have sent to the committee.
Okay, great. So I have a question about the areas, the designated areas that you calculated. Does that include the half mile and the quarter mile around like a downtown or a village center? Like for a neighborhood development area?
That does not. I have, we did calculate for a half mile around all of them. So it would be, a half mile around every designation, including the neighborhood development areas and growth centers. And that population number comes, leaves around 37% of the state population. So a much larger percentage of the population is living within a half mile of these areas.
Okay, yeah, that's important because it goes from 12% to 37% within a half a mile of those. Okay. Do members have questions? Well, this is your chance to ask mapping questions. A lot of this is based on mapping. It's a really great mapping tool. Great. Thank you for your testimony, Representative Stebbins. Okay.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Maybe. Hi, this may be a very unfair question, but I'm wondering, given that what you do all day is mapping, how you've seen other communities sort of balance some of the questions that you've been hearing be asked in S100. And if you have no comment, that's fair.
I'm not sure I can comment. To be quite honest, I have not been following the discussion in S100 and not very familiar with the issues. I was asked this discrete question and have been asked others related to specific areas, but some of this I haven't seen the full context.
Okay. Representative Bongartz.
I think that you said that the current designated areas in Vermont total about 32 acres. Square miles. Oh, square miles.
Square miles.
Okay, that helps. And if you expanded that to the half mile around each of those, do you know, or can you calculate how many square miles we'd then be talking about?
I'm not going to try to do that off the top of my head, but I'll follow up and send you that number. That would not be hard thing to do.
That would be great. Thank you. All right. I'm not seeing any further questions. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Great. Next up, we have Brian Redmond.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. For the record, my name is Brian Redmond. I'm the Director for the Drinking Water and Groundwater Protection Division in Vermont's DEC. A little bit about my background. I've been working in the water and wastewater regulatory programs in a variety of capacities for over 20 years now, and I spent the last 7 years as the Director for what's known as the Drinking Water and Groundwater Protection Division. The division that I manage regulates Vermont's public water systems, We issue permits for soil-based wastewater systems. We issue permits for private water supplies, so wells and springs. And we issue permits for connections to municipal or to public drinking water and wastewater systems. The topic of water and wastewater infrastructure is a very wide-ranging and broad topic that spans multiple programs across DEC. So I will rely on my experience and do the best that I can to answer any questions that you may have, but I may need to get back to you if I don't know the answer, given that this spans a lot more than just what I manage at DEC. I'd like to start just by saying, in terms of S100, ANR supports increasing housing opportunities in areas served by municipal water and sewer infrastructure that have the capacity to serve. Section 2 of the bill establishes prohibitions for making water and sewer capacity, quote, available. And from our perspective, ANR thinks that these provisions provide the tools necessary to ensure that the water and the wastewater systems are suitable for the development. More specifically, on page 5, lines 6 and 7, we see as important pieces of the bill. I also wanted to provide the committee a little bit more context on how these drinking water and wastewater systems are regulated, and specifically as it relates to this question around capacity. Starting with public water supplies, Vermont's public water systems are highly regulated entities through a series of both state and federal regulations. The state issues permits that regulate numerous activities in public water systems, including public water systems' ability to expand. Vermont has many small public water systems. I'm going to use round numbers here, but there are approximately 1,400 public water supplies in the state of Vermont. Approximately 400 of these public water supplies are classified as public community water systems. So those are the water systems that serve our cities, towns, villages, and fire districts. Those are classified as community water systems. Approximately 3 of the 400 community water systems in the state of Vermont serve populations of under 500 persons. We have a number of very small water supplies across the landscape.
300 of those 400.
300 of the 400 serve fewer than 500 people. There are only 7 systems currently in the state of Vermont that serve populations greater than 10,000. So not a lot of large systems and lots of small systems. 7.
Greater than how many?
10,000. 7 that are greater than 10,000. 400 in total of community. Of those, 300 serve fewer than 500 persons, and 7 serve greater than 10,000. It's a mouthful. A system's ability to expand is limited by its design capacity. And in a public water supply context, that could be its source water capacity. So the source of water, if it's a well or a water body that provides the community with the drinking water source, its treatment capacity. So the ability for the public water system to adequately treat all water that serves the community, or its storage capacity to meet the community's needs. You'll hear this again when I get to wastewater systems, but all water systems must operate within their design capacities to meet their permit limits. So those are the upper level thresholds. And they have to operate within those limits to be able to expand. So a water system's ability to expand is controlled by state issued operating permits. And these systems can fall into basically 3 categories under those operating permits. No restrictions on expansion, and this is the majority of our municipally owned community water systems. They can freely expand and grow. Not permitted to expand, but may have some limited capacity subject to our approval. So they may have a design limitation that they're bumping up against, or historical legacy data was brought over and we may not have a documented yield, let's say. And there may be a limited amount of ability to expand based on data that we collect on a routine basis. Again, these are highly regulated activities. And so there are a few systems that could not be permitted, but with some more engagement with the agency, there is ways for limited expansion. And then finally, there's some that have a documented inability to expand. That could be due to a limitation on the design side. So as an example, a small community may not have enough source water to meet their needs. They run out of water. They have to haul water to meet the community's drinking water needs. Those are the types of systems, and we do have a few in Vermont where we would have them on a moratorium from expanding their service. There are also instances in the community water context. Think homeowners associations. Those are classified as quote a community water system, privately owned, but community. Or small fire districts in the municipal context, that those water systems have been built out for their intended use and are fully built out. So many of those systems that are essentially at full build out are not able to expand until system improvements are undertaken to increase the ability to expand. So moving on to wastewater systems.
Let's see, do folks have water system questions? Yeah, Representative Sibilia.
Yeah, on the community water systems, thank you. On the HOA, that was a question that I was coming to there. Of the 300 or of the 400 community systems, how many of those are for HOA versus designated area or a town?
I don't have the data in front of me, but we can pull that.
You don't have the data.
Fairly.
It's not with you.
Yes, I can tell you how many of the community water systems are homeowners associations is essentially the data that you're looking for.
Yes.
Okay.
So for instance, in my town, we do not have public water. And we have, I don't even know how many community water systems, probably a dozen. So, and none in our residential area. So that is a really important data piece for me. So if you're able to provide that in the next.
Certainly can provide that. We definitely have the data.
Representative Pat.
Are the homeowner association type systems, are those considered public or community water systems, or are they considered private utilities that would, by statute anyway, be regulated by the PUC? You know?
So under the Safe Drinking Water Act, they would be regulated as public community water systems.
Okay.
So from a regulatory scheme side of things, they're considered public community, but they're homeowners association by legal organization. So they are privately owned, typically not for profit, typically not subject to public service.
Are there any still any private utility water companies still in existence? I know because they're regulated by statute, but I don't know that there are any left of those. So.
I believe there are a small handful. I can get the list if that's something of interest, but I do think there are a few left.
Sarah, we have a question from Representative Logan.
Thanks. Thanks for asking that question, Representative Sibilia. Just to be clear, a municipal sewer and water infrastructure. Is that public sewer and water infrastructure what's being referred to here in S100, or do the systems that you're talking about that serve homeowners associations count as municipal sewer and water infrastructure? Just not sure on the definition.
Yeah, I think, again, I'm not able to speak at all aspects of the bill, but I believe the intent is to drive the density into areas served by water and sewer, public water and sewer that I think are in designated areas, if I'm not mistaken. So yes, I think generally speaking, that's not going to be your homeowners associations. They are quote public water systems, but
But not municipal.
not really, I think, what this is driving at.
Right.
Thank you. I can ask our council also, because the definitions are on our end, some of them. I'm curious how much had a lot of influx of federal dollars, some of it's targeted for infrastructure. How many communities have either expanded or been able to add a public water system or are planning to?
So I will follow up after my testimony and provide a list. I had gotten your note about interest in understanding what's proposed or under construction, and I will provide you a list of what is current. On the drinking water side, there's very few. In my tenure, we've developed very few public water systems in the state. The two that come to mind right off the bat would be the town of Waitsfield. Similar to the situation in Dover, a number of small public water systems, and that a public water system was built there to consolidate those. And then the South Albert Fire District number 2. Right now, under consideration is the development of a new public water system for the town of Killington in response to widespread contamination of PFAS. So that's the municipal scale drinking water project that you'll see on that list. There's many more on the wastewater disposal side. I think you heard from Mr. Hancock from Montgomery earlier today. The agency has a village wastewater initiative to look at the development of wastewater capacity for villages that are currently not served. So I'll provide the committee with that list, plus anything that's been sort of inquired about from the agency. I will file that. As far as the federal money is concerned, we're at a moment in time where we have a transformational opportunity through the bipartisan infrastructure law. There's significant increases of funding specifically for public water systems, a 6-fold increase from what we historically see. The agency is developing a number of programs done through our annual intended use plan to identify the ways that those funds will be spent. A significant increase in just plain refurbishment of outdated infrastructure. That remains a priority and is still a priority with those funds.
Can you is there a brief history? Like, I feel like we're in a moment of significant interest at the federal level on water and sewer, and then, some of our towns have had it for a very, very long time, and then others never got it. And so I'm thinking that somewhere in the background, there's maybe Clean Water Act at the federal level, something motivated it, and then it sort of went off. It petered out. Is there the history of those investments at the highest level?
Yeah, I do think that there are people in the agency that would be better to speak about this than I. So Neil Kamen is our director of our water investment division, and Eric Blatt is director of engineering. Eric has been with the agency since really the beginning of this, even watched all this unfold, but essentially it was transitioned from construction grants into the revolving loan program. At the highest level, that's really the trajectory that this is seen. And we've been administering the revolving loan funds for a number of years now. We saw the major increase under the Recovery Act in 2009. Now we're seeing this substantial increase under the bipartisan infrastructure law. So there's a real focus on making sure that our water and sewer infrastructure is really suitable for the future. And that's the opportunity we're in right now.
I'll let you keep going. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to switch gears briefly to wastewater systems. So my role as the director, we oversee the soil-based wastewater systems. Peter Laflamme, who's our director of watershed management division, oversees the direct discharge wastewater systems. So in the state of Vermont, just to kind of give the big picture, there are 94 direct discharge wastewater treatment facilities in Vermont. So these are the treatment facilities that are being treated and discharging into surface waters. We, under our indirect discharge program, which those are the soil-based wastewater disposal, sewage disposal to the soil, into the groundwater, and indirectly into surface water. We have 14 permits for municipal systems under our indirect discharge program. The list that I will provide the committee is our Village Water and Wastewater Initiative funded through ARPA. You'll see a number of communities on there looking at soil-based wastewater disposal to meet their community wastewater needs. And I will follow up after this testimony with my remarks as well as the list. All wastewater facilities must operate within their design capacity to meet permit limits. So similar to drinking water, there's design requirements for the system, and the municipalities that are operating those facilities must operate within those design parameters. On the wastewater side of things, both organic capacity, so think waste strength, as well as hydraulic capacity, so think flow, volume, can limit a wastewater system's ability to expand. DEC issues permits to wastewater treatment facilities that require facilities to operate within their capacity limitations. And similar to drinking water, the allocations for wastewater capacity are managed by the municipality themselves under those permit limits. DEC issues permits to connect for both drinking water and wastewater systems through its wastewater system and potable water supply program. So that is our quote WW program, and that is a program that is administered under my division. I think that is all I had for you today. Thank you for your time, and I'll try to answer any questions.
Thank you for your testimony. We've been asked a number of years in a row and are being asked again to consider eliminating the hookup permit at the state level and letting the municipalities who can manage it themselves. Can you help us, just remind us what those permits do?
So the WW program, one of the permit triggers is that when there's a increase in design flow or a change in use of a building or structure, that would trigger our permitting requirements, as well as any new connection to municipal water and wastewater. There was a fair amount of this discussion that's been happening for several years, as you've indicated. In the 2019 regulations, we developed a new exemption that allowed designers or consultants of these projects an exemption from receiving permits if they could certify to the fact that the infrastructure that was serving that building or structure is suitable for its new and intended use. So we created an exemption in 2019. But the vast majority of connections require permits unless they're exempt.
So has there been uptake on that 2019 change? Are people certifying that they're?
I think some, yes. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but yes, an exemptions put in place that people will use it if they qualify.
And can you, is it a redundant system to have the state do it and the municipality do it?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think in previous years, the agency has supported the provisions for the transfer of the connection program. I think since that time, there's been a number of different conversations happening. And I think right now, working with our sister agency at Commerce and Community Development to offer language to look at the connections a little bit closer. I think bringing the stakeholders to the table, I think, is important. I think the connection permits involve sort of four parties. Right now, it's the development community, it's the consulting community, so the licensed designer, engineering consultant, it's the municipality, and it's the state. And I think the consultation I've had with some of the municipalities that I rely on for feedback on our programs have offered some very good suggestions. And I think bringing people to the table is beneficial to make sure that the system that is designed is the best system for Vermont.
Okay, so, but am I hearing two things? Or is there work that's needed, or are you bringing language to do that work that's needed?
I think we are going to propose language.
Okay, and what's your timeline on that?
Soon.
That would be good. Very good. We look forward to getting that tomorrow.
Okay.
Fabulous. Representative Bongartz.
I just want to make sure I got a couple things right. You said I was writing quickly. You said we have 94 direct discharge systems and 14 indirect discharge systems.
We have a total of 185 indirect discharge permits for sewage systems. 14 of those are municipal systems. So I was trying to narrow the field for where we may see housing development. So an example would be the town of Warren, the town of Rochester. Both of those communities have soil-based wastewater disposal through an indirect discharge permit.
Oh,
And
and
the other systems backed out the 14 from the 185. So the other systems are private, like they're like housing development or something.
Small municipally owned. Yes, I think, yes, small,
That's the 14, right?
the
I
14.
was asking about the others, the remainder of the 185.
Okay, the largely manufactured housing communities could be in there, small HOAs could be in there. Ski resorts are probably the biggest. Ski areas are largely indirect discharges. I'm happy to provide the committee with the full list if that is of interest. I had limited time to sort of crunch the data.
You've given me enough. That's
I think, yeah. John Adams is gone, but when we look at the mapped areas of places with wastewater, does it include the indirect and the direct?
I couldn't really see the map to.
Atlas, well, not the data he showed us, but like I've looked at it in the atlas just on my own, and it does show the sewer service areas, wastewater treatment areas, service areas is what I should say. And so does it include those, both of them?
I will need to confirm if the sewer sheds are there for the indirects. I don't know offhand.
And so there are 94 municipally owned direct discharge, but only 14 indirect.
Municipally owned
Yeah.
indirect discharge. Which I think is where that's probably, those are the areas that we're really talking about.
Right. Representative Clifford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your testimony. So what classification would spray fields fall under?
Sorry,
Class like spray fields if
indirect discharges.
indirect, okay.
I didn't hear what you asked.
What category would spray fields fall under?
So indirect regulates subsurface sewage disposal as well as spray. And then the land application of non-sewage waste. That's sort of the parameters of what requires an indirect discharge permit.
Thank you.
Are there further questions for Mr. Redmond? Not seeing any. Thank you for joining us today. And we look forward to all that extra information. Thanks. All right, members, our next witness, Mr. Brian Lowe has a bit of a time constraint. So I'm gonna welcome him up and let members know that we'll take a break after he testifies, because you have a limit. Fine.
Thank you. I'm happy to adjust if you need. It's childcare pickup. I don't mean to hold.
No, we're good. Just.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm actually very grateful. Would it be able to go right into remarks?
Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Brian Lowe. I'm the Executive Director at the Vermont Council on Rural Development. I want to thank Chair Sheldon, Vice Chair Sibilia, and Ranking Member Bongartz for the opportunity to testify with you today. And I'm testifying specifically to an amendment proposed for S100, not on S100 itself. I'm also aware I'm the final witness at the end of a long day.
We have to actually hear the amendment.
Ah.
We haven't heard it yet. We switched you with Representative Sibilia, who's going to present the amendment, but that's okay. We can do this. We do it all the time.
I'm very grateful to the committee. Thank you. And I will still keep my remarks short and focused, though. So the Vermont Council on Rural Development is a state rural development council. It is charged by the Federal Farm Bill with serving as a neutral, nonpartisan facilitator and convener in rural parts of the country. For us, that's Vermont. Our mission is to support Vermont citizens and residents to build prosperous and resilient communities through democratic engagement, marshaling resources, and collective action. Broadly speaking, we have several programs focused on strengthening local capacity, but much of our work is in communities where we are invited to focus on identifying local priority projects and connecting people to resources that make those projects happen. This gives us a lot of exposure to different kinds of challenges and opportunities that communities face when trying to advance different public projects and in particular infrastructure projects. As outlined in the proposed amendment that you'll hear about from Representative Sevilla shortly, the Rural Recovery and Coordination Council would convene a broad group of legislative leaders, administration officials, nonprofit, and academic partners to focus on structural changes that could support coordination across all levels of government in service to rural economic development, resilience, and environmental goals. Depending on the committee's timeline and interest, there may be an opportunity to add a select board member or two to the composition of that council to highlight further rural voice. And then the Vermont League of Cities and Towns has the ability to support that process should the committee want to make that amendment to the amendment. Moving this amendment forward would strengthen the important work the legislature and administration have already done this session in creating the $3 million Municipal Technical Assistance Program, which you did as part of the Budget Adjustment Act. That is designed to assist communities access state and federal funding, communities that are scored as kind of relatively low capacity, having the first place in line to access those funds. The council outlined in this amendment would work to identify ways to hear and support rural voice, to increase municipal capacity, to increase regional collaboration and the integration of state, regional, and local plans, as well as state, regional, and local policies and investments, and establish an Office of Rural Economic Development for some period of time to be determined. This kind of coordination would be useful not only in building on the $3 million set aside to increase local capacity that the legislature has already acted on. It would be important because it is happening at a time where there are this disparate amount of federal funding programs that are available that could support new infrastructure investments that we hear about in communities and ultimately lead to more housing creation. The work proposed also reflects some of the needs that we're hearing in communities, especially a desire for additional capacity to support a full kind of spectrum of engagement, from community engagement to identify specific local projects, all the way through grant administration and project management and closing out of these grants. Many times the infrastructure projects the communities that we work with identify are also projects that help support housing creation, whether that's wastewater in Montgomery or Burke or Londonderry, or downtown investments in places like Putney, or renovations or new builds directly. Bringing a broad range of voices together as a council, as is contemplated in the amendment, would help chart a useful and productive path forward to potential structural changes that could elevate the capacity needs that we hear about a lot in communities even further within state government. The last point I would make is that VCRD is envisioned as having a role organizing and supporting these meetings. In talking with Vice Chair Sevilla, we wanted to make clear we'd be helping facilitate these meetings, not just providing administrators, but actually running the meetings. That is our kind of job and function as an organization. And we think it's really important to have a clear role of exactly what we would be doing. As facilitators, we don't have a particular outcome in mind. Our job would be to draw out the wisdom of these council representatives and make sure that a broad range of voices are heard and make sure that there's a clear and timely path forward for this work. And then the last point I wanted to make, maybe a rookie mistake, but while we appreciate the funding allocation in this proposed amendment, I wanted to note that we felt after doing our budget for this program that we could do this for less than the $40,000 allocated. And in fact, we think we could do it for about $30,000. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your leadership. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you for your testimony. Would you be able to submit that in?
Yes, absolutely.
To Kate when you have a chance? Thanks. Members have questions? Shall I speak to this? Or shall I wait? I think we good if you, sure. If you want to speak to this part of it, because I think if we have further questions that you can still be here for, that's a good idea.
I think, Brian's done a great job talking about the ongoing work around rural capacity, but I think a number of us see that for our small towns, that hill is kind of growing. It's not leveling off. When we think about climate change, when we think about globalization of the workforce and digitization, these challenges are continuing to grow. Adaptation is continuing to grow. And we are looking at, Burlington and Halifax both having to interact with the state at the same level. And that's really challenging for Halifax. How are there systemic ways that we can think about that could be helpful to Halifax in order to be more proactive and likely to meet the pretty significant adaptation measures that are going to be necessary with climate change for our rural communities, and in building out and modernizing infrastructure. So we see this as foundational to beginning those kind of longer term conversations. And I think anything that you would clarify or clear up?
No, I think it's an excellent summary, and it feels like a useful functional body that can serve an important purpose and help elevate, consolidate, and act on some of the rural voice and concerns that we hear in communities across the state.
Can you tell us a little about your background in developing this section of this part of this proposal?
So this is sort of work that I do. Community development work is my job that I do outside of here, looking at ways we can build capacity, having communities come together to learn together, maybe work together, share resources together, to do things that they're not necessarily able to do on their own, or that they don't have the capacity to do on their own. And so looking at kind of a systemic way for putting this in place throughout the state for our rural communities. I think the work that we're doing is helpful. Actually, it's not enough, but it's helpful. And I think that model could be built on and replicated throughout the state. Particularly, I think about infrastructure, I think about climate change adaptation, and a lot of our little communities. So that's an answer to your question.
Well, I didn't know how much you worked with the people that are in this group to come up with this proposal.
The Chief Performance Officer, the Secretary of Commerce and Community Development. I think we've had ongoing conversations with them, members of the Rural Caucus. We've certainly worked with VCRD, members of the administration, the LCT, on how are we going to help our rural communities grapple with these significantly increasing challenges. So I'm not sure if I have gotten there yet, Madam Chair.
That's fine.
I wonder if it would be helpful to just elaborate slightly in that earlier this session, the really outstanding work creating that $3 million fund for communities to draw on from a capacity perspective, that helps provide a funding stream to support specific capacity needs community to community. What is missing, though, is how across disparate federal programs and some disparate state programs, how the experiences of those communities and how the experiences of a variety of different nonprofit and state partners in a very different funding environment, how that is being kind of pulled together into structural recommendations that come back to the legislature to consider. And so some of what is of interest from a VCRD perspective in this bill is how this structure that Representative Sebelius and others have laid out is a way to kind of consolidate some of that wisdom into a group that could make serious recommendations back to the legislature to consider in the next session.
Great. All right. Well, thank you for your testimony. And
Thank you.
members will take a 10-minute break.